It's the same for every individual, same for every company. If you understand this, look at your income, expenses, and your savings, and then do a stress test so that you get yourself secure. The same things happen over and over again through time for basically the same reasons. A lot of these things happen once in a lifetime, and if you don't go back and see how they worked over time, then you're in trouble. There's a pattern. I could describe the pattern, but there's a pattern that happens over and over again, and we're in a particular spot in the pattern. And then to understand it, not just because it happened before, but to understand mechanistically how it happens, and then one has a sense of how to deal with it. Pandemics come along occasionally, but anything that's important. Let me say the three most important circumstances that existed before we had the downturn, which was caused by a pandemic, but any downturn would have produced the same results. The three most important things that are happening in the world now are that we're at the end, late in a long-term debt cycle in which central banks cannot control monetary policy the same way. They can't lower interest rates. They can't get money to a lot of people who need the money in the traditional way. So just like in 1929 to 1932, there was a debt crisis that came as a result of an excessive amount of debt in the boom years. And then when you have that in 1932, we hit zero interest rates. And when they hit zero interest rates in 32, like in 2008, central bank prints money and buys financial assets. When someone borrows for a number of years and has to pay back, makes a promise to deliver currency, that's a bond. And so one man's debts are another man's assets, which we call a bond, and that is a promise to deliver currency. And so what happens in these cycles is that normally central banks can stimulate the economy by lowering interest rates. But when you hit zero interest rates, that doesn't work. So the last time it hit zero interest rates was 1932. And what they did in 1932 was the same thing they did in 2008. And that is that the central banks prints a lot of money and buys government bonds. And so we're doing that now. Think of it this way. The central government, and also companies and individuals, don't have the capacity to create money. So the central government has the right to determine they can tax people, they can get money from people, and they can spend money on whatever they want to spend money on. But they don't have the right to print money and create money and credit like the central bank does. Central bank is the Federal Reserve. Similarly, the Federal Reserve does not have the right to spend money and determine how it's spent. That's for Congress.
So the Federal Reserve, I think most people think, is a department of the government, but they're not. Are they a private bank?
No, they're a part of the government that the system has put into place so to get the creation of money out of the political system. It is within Congress, but it has a set of rules, like the Supreme Court has a set of rules. That means that the president can't control it, the Congress can't control it, that it's operating in a separate way. And so the important thing to know about this crisis, and that it happened in the 1930s, is that in order to get the checks that we're needing, a lot of people, a lot of companies need checks. Now, where will those checks come from? So there'll be checks from the government. The type of support we're going to receive is two types of support. Where's all this money come from? So the government, when they say, I'm going to pay more for unemployment insurance, or I'm going to give you a loan for a small business, or so on, where do they get the money from? They either tax it, but if they tax it, that's bad. So the government, they can borrow it. That's what a deficit is. The government runs a deficit. And then the question is, who's going to borrow it when everybody's financially strapped? And the Federal Reserve says they have the power to print money, and they will say, I will borrow it and I will lend you the money. So the Federal Reserve is lending the money, and it is also lending others the money. The important thing to know is that all that we think about money is not limited in any way. There's a certain amount of money out there. It's all make-believe. It's all digital. So they could change the digits and then they can create money. Now that's an important consideration, because if they can create money so easily, how do we know it's going to be of value when they're creating a lot of it? That's one of the considerations that are being faced today. But the main thing to know about this, stepping back for the big picture, is that every individual, every company, and every government has a certain amount of money that comes in the form of income, a certain amount of expenses, and then a certain amount of savings. So you do individually, and all your listeners do. And it works the same way for everyone, so that if their income falls and they to be less than their expenditures, they're in trouble unless they have a good savings. And then they go to the savings. So all around the world, there are lots of entities that are in trouble in that way. So the government, the two parts of the government, the US government, two parts, want to give checks to people. Now it's difficult to decide who gets it, who doesn't get it. But if they don't give checks to people or to companies, those will go bankrupt because they may not have enough savings. So you saw J. Crew just went bankrupt. And you'll see others go bankrupt because they don't have enough. And so when they go bankrupt, then that's a whole other process. So in order to prevent that, they have to give money. And so they print money. We call it print. There's not even paper much. It's digitally create money. And then that comes in the form of loans. The Federal Reserve will buy government bonds, so it's a transaction of buying it, and they will also buy private bonds.
Okay.
They might pick a company, many companies, and they'll say, I will buy your bonds, which is the equivalent, I will lend to you. And that's what happens.
Okay.
And that's happened through history. So what we're going through is the same process as happened in the 1930 to 1945 period. So as I was saying, there are three important things. That is one. The second is large wealth gap. Third is that we have a rising power in the form of China emerging to compete or challenge the United States leadership. So when you have these three things together, it's a challenging mix, and it's happened repeatedly. Less effective monetary and credit system makes it, they have to print a lot of money, can threaten the value of money. Second, when you have a large wealth gap and you have an economic downturn, people are more inclined to have conflict. So how that's dealt with, we're going to reconsider how that wealth will be divided. And that'll change taxes and relationships. And then the third is we're no longer in a world order where the United States is the only dominant power. These three things existed, and the most important things existed. And then we had the downturn in terms of the virus. So you could think of the virus like being a tsunami that came, and if it went, and if we had no more of it, it still would have left a lot of economic damage. So in all different ways. So the economic damage has to be understood and dealt with. It's the same for every individual, same for every company, same. And if you understand this, then you understand there are three things. The first is look at your income, your expenses, and your savings. And then do a stress test so that you get yourself secure. If you were to lose your income, or if the income were to fall beyond a certain level, and you play that out, maybe that means you go get unemployment insurance, or whatever. How long can you live in an acceptable lifestyle? And do you have a savings that is adequate for that? Okay, so what you do is you calculate, if I lived in a simpler lifestyle and I had this amount of earnings, how many months or years could I live acceptably? Then you look at what do you put the money in? What do you save in?
Don't you worry, though, that there is a level of financial literacy?
You know the parts, right? It's income, expenses, and savings. Okay, now you can go get the money. Maybe the money comes in and you say, okay, my unemployment benefits are going to be this, or but those are the parts. Then the issue is, how clever are you at dealing with those? Smart people working together in a bipartisan way have the capacity of managing this well. So if I was giving political advice, and that's not what I do, but if I was giving political advice, the most important thing, I think, is who can do this, who's got the intelligence to do the engineering, plus to do it in a manner that we are not fighting with each other. That what history has shown us is that when things get difficult, people get stressed, and they can get angry, and they could all fight with each other, and that produces the next leg of a terrible economy, because the economy won't work efficiently if people are fighting with each other. The system doesn't work well. So one would have to say, who's going to bring the country together behind sensible, I would say, bipartisan programs? Because if you don't have that, then you have a form of revolution, and you don't have good management. And that's the greatest risk, I would say, politically. An example of would be the differences in the way Roosevelt did it. So again, 1929 to 32, interest rates hit zero, they print money, we had a large wealth gap, and then they sat down and they figured out, how do we keep it orderly, and how do we change the circumstances with whether it's taxes, or how do you reorganize it so that the system works well. There is a risk also at the same time, because the world is going through that, there's a risk of conflict. So in Germany, Hitler came in power in 1933, and he came in power in 1933 because there was a lot of internal fighting as to try to produce order, because everybody, the left and the right, the communists and the fascists, and they're all fighting about wealth, because everybody's fighting about wealth when you have a downturn. And then they were democracies. 4 democracies existed then that chose not to be democracies because they became so disorderly that they wanted some strong leader to take charge and run the country. And then, of course, we had a bunch of those types of leaders, and then they had a war. That's how World War II happened. So when you look at that, that's the political landscape. But back to the average man in terms of his finances, I would say the important thing is those 3 elements: to have a plan, and maybe to have a plan with both your family. How do you get down when things got tough? And then you have to look at what happens in policy.